morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have got a pleasure to start the last panel dealing with federalism. We had the term here several times, yesterday, today. When Slovak candidate for commissioner, Maroš Šefčovič, was grilled by European Parliament in 2009, he was asked whether he is a federalist. His answer was, if you explain me what federalism is, then I can give you an answer. I think that regarding the term, the definition of federalism, that we can have different approaches. And if we look at the term from historical point of view, so it originates in Roman Catholic social theory, then also in Protestant Reformism, when the term federalism was used for the first time. As a godfather or the founder of the term was appointed Heinrich Bullinger in 16th century, and then theories of Johannes Albinus at the end of 16th, beginning of 17th century. Still some terms from Catholic terminology, like subsidiarity, are used in European Union and European context. If we look at the term federalism vis-à-vis the EU, we can see that this term was heavily used, especially around the year 2000. This was the year of so-called grand debate. The debate about finalité, about the future of Europe, the year when Joschka Fischer gave his famous speech at Humboldt University in May 2000, from confederation to federation. And so the term was on the table. So it was sort of constitutional moment in Europe, or it was believed at that time, because Europe was on the eve of enlargement. And then the other speeches given, they were reacting on what Joschka Fischer said. For instance, it was French reaction, federation of nation states, what was considered to be sort of oxymoron. Then there was more communitarian, more federal approach of smaller states who are benefiting from their participation in federal model. I don't want to talk too much because time is running and we have distinguished speakers, but nevertheless I would like to share one experience with you, and this is experience from the convention. I am sorry, Peter Bidhar, I very much appreciate what you have done, but I am not very happy with what you were saying yesterday. I don't think that it was a big circus. I think that it was intellectual exercise and that it was an attempt to make the EU more democratic, because before treaties were formed by intergovernmental conference. So there were only the heads of executives, ministers, but in this case there were also representatives from the opposition parties. It means from the parliament and from European institutions. And I think that the big problem was that in fact no one cared, that even so that as to Czech delegation, we had very different opinions, but there was one opinion which we shared, and it was that we were complaining against the ignorance of media and public. But anyway, at that time, federation, and this term was considered as an F word, because everyone was afraid, because they were afraid that people being in the convention could be criticized of forming a superstate. That's why in the Constitutional Treaty and in Lisbon Treaty the word federation is not present. But we would like to look at this dynamism between centralization and decentralization, what federalism means from different point of view, and to see different models. European model, American model, Indian model, maybe Canadian model. Unfortunately, we do not have this morning with us Professor Larry Siedentrop, because he got sick, but Paul will be so kind and he will present some of his ideas, but also his ideas. But our first speaker will be Jan Macháček, who is the member, the director of the Board of Trustees of Václav Havel Library. He is also journalist, he is musician, and very good commentator. So Jan, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I would probably start where Petr Pithard ended yesterday, when he was explaining how he was campaigning in little villages and little towns and speaking with ordinary people who, to his surprise, didn't have any elementary knowledge about what the Senate is, what's the difference between majority and proportional system is, etc. So this is the same about federalism, about centralism, and it applies to the whole of Europe, and probably not only Europe. I would really think that the elementary precondition for speaking about federalism is that we know what federalism is, and for this discussion to be fruitful, that voters and citizens understand what federalism is and what federalism is not. But before they are supposed to understand what federalism is, they have to understand why do we have an upper chamber, how particular electoral systems, what are the basic differences. So I would certainly call, at least in Czech Republic, for what everyone is speaking these days, how important is this to increase the level of understanding of mathematics in school, etc. But some kind of basic elementary civic education, something what in Czech used to be called státoprávní věda, it's certainly necessary, otherwise we will never get out of political and institutional crisis. So people have to understand elementary things, not only in Czech Republic, but all over Europe. But even a lot of elites and even a lot of educated people don't understand like these basic terms. And people in particular countries, when they hear federalism, if you would speak to Brits, that they would probably think, hey, federalism, what do you exactly mean? Do you mean centralization or do you mean decentralization? Because for Brits, federalism probably for most of them means decentralization, which means giving more powers to Parliament in Wales and Parliament in Scotland. So this is what they consider federalism. Whereas when people on the continent, when they speak about federalism, for a lot of them it means more centralization, or at least some basic centralization, or basic some whatever little bit stronger central institution, which is once again also not exactly federalism to me, but this is what most of the people think. I am afraid that a lot of people on the continent sort of think that federalism is some kind of a superstate, etc. And I can certainly imagine that people in Germany or in Austria know very well what federalism is, because their federalism is basically functioning similarly like federalism in the US, whereas in France, which has a tradition of strong centralist state, they probably would tend more to understand to imagine federalism more like centralism. So the first definition, to me, I'm not going to go to the history, but let's speak more about examples of things which are functioning. So I mentioned that there is a functioning federalism in Germany, in Austria, in the US, in Canada, in India. But what are the basic principles for everyone? I would say this is certainly that federalism is not centralism, or if I put it in a little bit softer way, federalism is not only centralism. The idea of federalism to me is based on checks and balances. So, and why do we have checks and balances? Checks and balances are coming on not only from the Enlightenment, but also some people could say that it has to do with Christianity, with 10 amendments, that the most dangerous people are those who believe that they fulfill easily in their life all 10 commandments, and they understand 10 commandments perfectly. So there is this need for checks and balances is not coming only from enlightenment, from a vision of rationality, but also from a notion that if you give power to the people who think that they understand everything perfectly and they organize everything perfectly, they have the power, is dangerous, and therefore power has to be limited. And so there are some basic values from which these checks and balances and limits and caps on power are coming from. The other important principle is that federalism is based into an extent on asymmetrical representation, which we know from the history of our dual federalism in Czechoslovakia, that we have certain institutions existing in a smaller entity. You had Slovak Academy of Science, I don't want to mention it, but you also had the Slovak Communist Party, the Czech one. And this is similar if Brits speak about federalism, giving the powers to local parliaments in Wales. We have no English parliament, but you have a parliament in Wales and you have a parliament in Scotland. So that's what I consider asymmetric and disproportionate representation. Protection of smaller, weaker entities, protection of minorities is definitely a very important principle of federalism. And the next and last one, very important principle of federalism to me is inner competition. Inner competition must be protected, so particular entities of the federal state should compete with each other with different taxation into an extent, definitely with different, for instance, environmental norms, with different priorities as far as culture, nature, whatever. So it's not homogenization. Centralism is based on an idea of inner competition. If the inner competition is liquidated, you have no more federalism. I will jump a little bit forward now and look at what is happening in Europe these days, that you have certain things which are already approved within the Eurozone and partially within the whole European Union, have nothing to do with federalism. It's as very strict and rigid centralism. If you look at fiscal policies, what is already approved, sort of 2-pack, 6-pack European semester, fiscal compact, etc. So it is absolutely hard to imagine, I don't know about Canada and India, and will be discussed later, that part of these agreements is that before, especially in the so-called 6-pack, which applies to Eurozone countries only, that before, when you start to plan your budget in the spring, you have to discuss it with Brussels. When you have first draft of the budget approved before submit, or simultaneously when you submit it to your own local parliament, you have to send it to Brussels, which has the right to approve of it and send very strong recommendations. It's a very perfectly defined procedures. They give sort of country-specific recommendations what they should do and should not do with their budget. After the budget is approved in the local parliament, it has to be sent to Brussels again for a kind of review, and this would be absolutely unacceptable in the United States in a normal functioning federation. It would be, if you would tell people in Texas that they have to get their budget approved before they vote for it, they would leave the US Federation, I am afraid. So there are already parts of European integration which consist of pure centralism and not and have nothing to do with the federal idea. Why is that? So I think that by creation of European Central Bank, Europe entered the process of creating a federation, because not coincidentally European Central Bank is the most powerful economic institution and most powerful governmental, in a way, institution in the Eurozone, and it is constructed purely on a federalist principle. It has this upper chamber system within itself. So there are two. There is an operational committee, and there is a basically upper chamber which is representing where Luxembourg has the same representation as Germany, which is, when I was speaking about US Federation, this is a principle of US Senate, when Montana has 2 senators, even though it has very few people living there, whereas and California also has 2 senators. So ECB is based on this system of 2 chambers, which is also an important principle of federalism. And by creating this most powerful institution in the Eurozone and in the European Union on federalist principle, you start very powerful institutional dynamism, and you are supposed to finish other important pillars which usually exist in a federation and which Europe and Eurozone is lacking. So if you created a European Monetary Union, which you also have monetary union in the United States or in Canada or in India, what these countries have, they have at least limited central budget, whereas European Union has a budget slightly over 1%, and we know very well that the budget has been decided, which is to me very unfortunate, in the middle of the crisis, to lower this budget, so it's going to be only 0.9 or 0.8% very soon, because the budget for the European Union is approved for not only for a year but for more years. So it's in the middle of the crisis. We somehow we decided to go the other way around than we were supposed to, I believe. So you need to have some limited common taxation, which is absolutely non-existent. I'm not calling for a higher taxation if more things or certain things are decided or regulated from a federal level. You don't have to have them regulated or being taken care of from the national level. So I'm not calling here for higher taxation. I'm calling here for some kind of a central taxation, and it doesn't have to be huge to me. And it needs to have some common Eurobond, which is guaranteeing at least a certain level of mutual solidarity. So Europe is not having any of this. It only has an ECB, and it creates enormous tensions within the system. Currently, in the European Union, If you visit Brussels, everyone says like there is no way that there will be a new treaty negotiated. Everything will be sort of arranged within existing treaties, but I don't believe that it is sustainable for a long term, and Europe certainly needs some vision after the crisis settles down a little bit to change the treaties and to create limited elements of federalism. Federalism is obviously a process. I don't believe that it's going to happen. I don't think that's going to happen overnight. It's been a long-term process in the United States. After the federation was created in the United States, only 120 years later, European Central Bank was, Federal Reserve System was created, whereas, so the Central Bank was created basically 120 years after the Federation was created. In Europe, we started with creation of the Central Bank. So, but even though I don't actually really believe that it's going to last like 200 years in Europe, so it's going to last some time. But on the other hand, if you look at the processes, there is already the banking union being created. It's being created without the most important part of the banking union, which is some common fund which would recapitalize bank or etc. It's going to be created in 10 years if everything goes fine, which is a very long-term lasting process. There is still no real discussion about common European deposit insurance scheme. On the other hand, if you look at the US, as far as I understand it like a lot of US constitutionalists believe that creation of American Federation was finished only in 1930s after the Federal Deposit Insurance Scheme was approved. Before, the Federal Deposit Insurance was being taken care of only by particular national states. And so the last two remarks would have to do with culture and identity. Critics of European Union absolutely believe that, or European federalism, that there is no way to create federalism because you have completely different cultures and you have completely different nations, socially, culturally, people don't speak the same language, etc. So with the language, it certainly is a complicated thing, but it's not the only thing we should pay attention to. So if you look at the United States, if you look at Louisiana, and if you look at Minnesota, for instance, to me, cultural differences are also enormous. There are enormous cultural differences between California and New England. In Louisiana, there was enormous corruption in police forces. There was almost a failed state after the hurricane Katrina. The world had paid attention to it. In Puerto Rico, for instance, there is a state bankruptcy which is comparable to the situation in Greece, and no one is paying attention to that. I know, but it's part of the US in a way. So, but it certainly doesn't have a comparable attention, even though it's a territory which is not that smaller than Greece is. Greece was occupying front pages on every newspapers in Europe for years, whereas bankruptcy of Puerto Rico goes almost unnoticed, even though it is really happening, and it's also a recreational zone to an extent. And the second thing is identity, which is the stronger argument. You cannot have a federalism if you don't have a political nation, if you don't have a political identity. So I believe that political identity can be artificially supported and artificially created. This by the elites, obviously, who have to have a certain vision. So I am not, in this respect, I disagree with our former President Klaus, who constantly emphasized only spontaneous processes, that everything has to be spontaneous and nothing should be supported artificially. I think it applies for a special discussion what is spontaneous and what is artificial. But if you create some, as I mentioned, limited European taxation, you would be very surprised how quickly people would pay attention to what is happening to their taxes if they send them directly every year to Brussels. You can, if we would go for an upper chamber of European Parliament, where every member state of the European Union would have 2 senators, so these people would probably remember these 2 senators much better than they remember like dozens of MEPs. They would really pay attention to what they do. You can create a direct vote for European president. Peter Pidhart was speaking about it yesterday also. You can you can have some much better functioning or create a basically system of EU citizenship on a different basis than it exists now. And the very last thing, we published at the library a book of Václav Havel's speeches and writings about Europe, and when he spoke about European identity, he obviously said, okay, I agree that we are different from Americans. If Americans say, okay, I am US and I'm American, and only second thing that he says, I am from Indiana or Minnesota. The Europeans always say, I'm Italian, I'm Swedish. But he says, you immediately realize that you are European when you are coming to Saudi Arabia and having a lunch in Saudi Arabia, and you are asked, where are you from? You probably say you are European, so that I am quoting Václav Havel. So to realize which your identity is first or second, it's also based on where you are. So I am not so naive and utopian that I would believe that Europe has a chance to create a first identity, being a European, that is going to be first identity of yours very soon. But it could be the role of sort of second identity can certainly be increased, and it should be supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan, who told us how complex the definition and the term and the reality of federalism is. But I will give the microphone to Paul Flather. Paul Flather is Secretary General at Europeo, what is the association of oldest and distinguished university. I'm happy that Charles University is one of them, together with Oxford, Sorbonne, and other. And Paul is also a fellow at Mansfield's College. So please, Paul.
Can you hear me? I think I have a microphone. Europe is not ready for federalism. Europe is not ready for federalism. That is the conclusion that Larry Siedentop comes to in his book. I'm not Larry Siedentop. I've been asked to fill in a little bit. So I wrote a few remarks. But I thought it might be good, because he is an important contributor to this debate, if we just recalled his main arguments in his book. That is his conclusion. You might say you'd expect that from a British intellectual, but I think what he says is quite important for us. He gives 2 reasons for reaching that conclusion. The first one, and Jan has touched on this, is what he calls the threat to social diversity. He argues that a stronger centre threatens the special nature of democracy in Europe. And he suggests that the special feature of democracy in Europe is that our pluralism is pluralist. In other words, we're multi-pluralist. Each of our countries is democratic, or a liberal democratic state, but in its own way, based on its own history, based on its own politics, its own culture, and its own spirit. He uses the word spirit of the nation. And so he argues that a uniformity, and I'm using federalism, Jan, in the way that the Germans would use it, rather than the British. Larry Siegentop uses it to mean centralizing. He argues that to centralize or to create would create a kind of uniformity which would undermine the essentialist spirit that has made Europe what it is. So that's his first argument. And he does, and I thought it'd be quite interesting, he does discuss a little bit America in this context. And he asks the question, why does federalism, a central system, thrive in America and work as a very effective liberal democratic state? And he identifies two important reasons. The first one is that there is a very prevalent middle class. And he contrasts that with Europe, where of course we've got a widespread middle class. We know that. We're probably all parts of, members of it. But our middle classes vary. They vary across countries, and they're also much more stratified. And so we have a much more class-based nature in our society, and a much more differentiated nature in our society. And listening yesterday to the contributions, I think people would say, and certainly Klaus Offer made this point, that in the crisis there is going to be greater differentiation. There's going to be more losers and more people left below. So that was the first reason. The second reason is that the Americans have a special attitude to the market, which is different to ours. In America, he argues, the market is totally accepted. It is a given. In Europe, we argue about the market. What kind of market? Is it unfettered? Should it be controlled? Should it be managed? We're much more interested in a mixed economy by rights. That's where we start from, and then we might go more neocon, or we might go more socialist. Now, the market in America allows its relationship to that each citizen is the same. In other words, each citizen has equal access to the market and can make the market work or not work for him or her. Now, it isn't a kind of model that I would like, or many of us would like, because the market can be very cruel. And we know that huge numbers, 25–30% of Americans live below quite an unacceptable poverty line. And there are millions who have to rely on food banks. But his point is that the middle class is more prevalent and the market relationship is more accepted. And therefore this centralized model works in America. His second argument against federalism in Europe is that the foundations have not been laid properly. And I think this is very important for all the discussions we had yesterday and for this session. So his argument is that the rush towards federalism, as he puts it, since the 1980s, has been pursued by an elite group, an elite class, we recognize that. But that class is itself not prepared to deliver the preconditions to make federalism successful. What are those preconditions? Well, the main precondition is to have a proper dispersal of power and authority. And I think what he's getting at is that the national elites are very much in favor of a greater or more Europe, but they're not prepared to give up their own power. Okay? No politician I know has ever willingly given up power, and I've been a politician. So that's the first part. The second part is that you have to have an increased sense of political participation. Now, Larry's book, I managed to find it on my shelf. I think I was actually going to get him to sign it. Luckily I brought it so I could dip into it last night. But I think that he wrote this 15 years ago. I think it's 15 years ago, 2000. So he would have probably put it to press 15 years ago, 1999. So things have changed, and we've had a lot of discussion in the previous session about political participation. But in a way, I think both of his main points are quite prescient. And he goes on to make a third sort of sub-point. He says that the real danger, and we can ask ourselves if this is happening, the real danger is that the elite will introduce a language of democracy while they disguise their efforts towards federalism. It's quite a canny thing. Now, he isn't here, so I have the pleasure of actually commentating on his theories without him being here. And I just thought that I do think it's prescient because, first of all, there is a fear, isn't there, amongst so many different groups in Europe about creeping centralization, and the fact that the key building blocks of Europe, the freedoms, as we call it, particularly the freedom to movement, are being enforced, but there are other people who are not part of the discussion, the political process, who are paying the price. And the second point about foundation, I think we've discussed that a lot, so probably I don't need to say very much, but as a political scientist, the bedrock test of democracy, of accountability, we always feel in England is, can we throw the rascals out? And you have to ask yourself, can you throw the rascals in Brussels out if they get things wrong? They threw themselves out once because corruption was so bad, but basically we can't. So there is a fundamental gap. However much there are direct elections and they're extended, and I'm excited about the development on parties. So those are my points about Larry. I wanted to make a few remarks about America and Europe, and then a few remarks about India, if you allow me. So, first of all, America and Europe. I think quite often comparisons are odious, but I think there is a valid comparison between America and Europe. They're comparable in terms of land masses, in terms of population, and of course we share a basic collection of liberal democratic values. So we're not trying to compare China and Europe. I mean, that is just too much of a stretch. You remember the old joke, don't you, that the Europeans went to America, invented America, and Europeanized America. And then the Americans decided to Americanize America. And then they came over here and they Americanized Europe. And now what we're trying to do, and this is part of the conference, we're trying to re-Europeanize Europe. So there's quite a bit of overlap. Now, what I thought was fun was, let's just go back to the early debates, the Federalist Papers, those wonderful documents. And you remember there was some of the best writing ever, I think, on politics. There was this anonymous person, Publius, who discussed what federalism meant. Publius was an acronym for James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. And they discussed two key ingredients, which Jan has covered very well. One is the question of checks and balances, and the other question is the division of power, the clear division of power between the centre and the 13 states. Remember, there were 13 states who were very jealous to guard their independence. They just thrown off the yoke of imperialism, if you like. They hardly wanted a new central imperialism imposed on them. And these debates were very fierce, and in many ways, I think that is when, although you quoted someone else using the word, I think federalism was invented in the 1780s in those debates. I know the Greeks talked a little bit about federalism, but it was about two city-states having an alliance, and also the Swiss, I think, had a sort of federation or confederation in the 18th century. But it was invented in those debates, and very successfully. So they did divide the key powers. They gave the centre key powers, including taxation, which is critical, and foreign policy, and so on. But they gave the states a huge amount of decentralized power. Okay, and funny enough, one of the powers that the states have is to control the franchise. And of course, that was the crucial point in the controversial 2000 election. Florida controlled its own franchise, so it could fiddle the people who could or couldn't vote. That election was stolen by Bush. There's absolutely no doubt about it. All the research shows it. But Florida, run by Jeb Bush, with a fierce Republican Attorney General, stole it, prevented black people from registering and from going to vote. So it's quite interesting, this division of power. So what did they do? They had as you said, a two-state system. They had a Senate and they had a House of Representatives. They had a Bill of Rights, and they crucially separated the executive from the legislature. And of course it was a process. Jan is absolutely right. These things are a process of ebb and flow. And you had this controversial figure called Andrew Jackson, who created a sort of sense of populism. And remember, they fought a bloody civil war before they got anywhere near a proper sense of rights. It still took another 100 years before black people were properly enfranchised. So they had a lot of hassle, but the root was set in the 1780s, and I think it's quite instructive for us. We've had the convention debates and so on, but we didn't have that marvelous constitutional making moment. Now, what is this? How does this impact on Europe? And it seems to me there are 5 points, very briefly. First of all, back to Larry's point about the middle class. Now, I think that in Europe we're still building the middle class. And the middle class is growing. We can see it. We can see it in our, if we came from a working class or lower class background, our children will probably go to university and be part of the middle class. But the point I made earlier stands. The middle class here is very differentiated, and the crisis has increased this differentiation and segmentation and inequality. So that's our first problem. The second problem is language. The Americans have got a common language. Okay, they started with a common language. Now we are getting a common language. It happens to be English. But it's arriving there. This conference is an example, and the French ambassador kindly spoke in English as well. So we're moving towards that. It's not a question of one language winning. It's just a question of which is most convenient for political competency and democracy, and it happens to be English. Fiscal powers, no problems in America. They've got it sorted. We are in a huge battle about this. And, of course, the crisis has propelled us towards opening this discussion much more seriously than we have dared to do before. But individual politicians are not going to give up their powers very easily, are they? By the way, we talked a lot about power. Where is power? And you must remember the simple aphorism, power is where the money is. So we need to look where the money is. Do you know what proportion of money Brussels has? It has less than 1% of the total European GDP, okay? And very few civil servants, actually. We talk about the Brussels bureaucracy or the bureaucracy. I mean, they have far fewer civil servants than I think Lithuania or Latvia or so on, so small countries. So it's, power isn't in Brussels in one important sense. Common culture, you discussed it very well, and so did Larry. I think Americans, they have this founding myth. So we know that Americans are always, hyphenated people, we say. You're an Afro-American, or you're a Spanish-American, or German. We're not yet a Euro-Czech, or a Euro-Brit, or a Euro-Italian. You discussed it. We might become that in time, but we're not there yet. And Larry would say we've got to be a bit hesitant about it. And then the constitutional moment. It seems to me myths and constitutional moments are very important. And although we came out of a critical crisis, the war, we have done it in process. So we haven't got, we haven't got our Lincoln, we haven't got our Gettysburg Address, we haven't got our sort of founding fathers. Though I know Monet and Schumann substitute for that. And almost in time they're building up, they're becoming more famous as we go on. But I suppose our Lincoln is Delors. Well, I don't know if he cuts the mustard. Okay? Now, just a couple of final remarks. I'm going to be very quick, because we do want to hear from you, I know. I think that Europe, apart from those differences with America, have got facing 2 interesting tests. Okay, so I just want to put those on the table, then I want to make a final couple of points about India. The first test is provided by Hungary. Okay? Now, we have a fantastic process of assessment, analysis, we call it the acquis communautaire, of getting people into our club, okay? But the key membership rule is that you follow the rule of law. That is absolutely the basic bedrock issue. I'm sure we all agree on it. So what happens when a country starts breaking the rule of law? Because Hungary is clearly doing that. Fidesz came to power, introduced a new constitution in 2011, has now made 4 constitutional amendments which have cancelled legal precedents. And they're attacking the academy, they're attacking the media, and yet we are relatively powerless. I know things are happening now. So the first test for us, we haven't even got to federalism or the big federation, but even in our weak system, I think we are being tested, and we're not rising to the test because we haven't done enough to. I mean, Jan Zelonka, who's a colleague of mine at Oxford, talks about Europe as a voluntary empire. It's kind of an empire, but you don't get conquered by the Romans and Napoleon. You join it because you want to, because you want the benefits of the market, and you want to move around, and you want some of that money, and so on and so forth. But the voluntary empire has not been very good on testing someone who breaks the rules. The other big test, of course, is Scotland. Now, we aren't very clear what happens when an area breaks off from another member area within our club. We've had a famous divorce, the Czech and Slovak one, but that was done outside the European Union. And so we have all these funny speeches about, well, if you break away, you can't be a member of the Union when they're already, of course, Scottish people are very good European citizens and so on. So I think we're facing 2 interesting tests. Quite interesting, in America, Arizona talked about breaking away, and no chance. So it's a test for all federations. How do you deal with that? I would like to mention a couple of points about India by way of closure, because I saw the title of the session, and I think, as I said before, there's very good reasons to compare America and Europe, very compelling reasons, and we can learn a lot from each other. We do. But it's interesting also to look a bit around the world. Now, India, I think, is also comparable. It's got, now here's a funny thing, it's got 28 states, and Europe has 28 states. It's got 22 official languages, and I think Europe has got 24, but I may be wrong. It's also got a common language, though one that's only spoken by 2% of the population, and that's English. In fact, English is the only language that unites the South, which speaks Telugu, Tamil, and Malayalam, and the Hindi-speaking North. They don't bother to learn each other's languages because they don't want to give in to being too sort of controlled by the other section. So there's a lot of overlap. Of course, it's got 3 or 4 times the number of people, and huge disparities and inequalities and different problems. But the 2 interesting things. And by the way, it's a centralized unitary state, so it's run out of Delhi, and Delhi can impose president's rule. That means it can run a state if it feels the state has gone into crisis. It's just taken over Delhi. Delhi, in other words, the big government, has just taken over the city government, because there's an anti-corruption government which has arrived in Delhi, and it has gone on strike. The elected government, this is quite interesting, the elected government, which came on an anti-corruption platform, has gone on strike against all the other politicians and police for being corrupt. So Delhi has no government. It's a very interesting set of political movers. The 2 things I want to leave with you is about decentralization. And what is happening in India are 2 very interesting decentralized pressures. The first thing is called Panchayati Raj. They've introduced a new layer of very local elections, and 1 in every 3 people elected has to be a woman. And in the past 10 years, there have been 3 million village-level elections. They've set up a panchayati, which means a little council, and you've got 1 million elected women. And some of those councils are now run by women, and some of the women are now moving up to the more regional, and we hope to the state level. So that's an incredibly empowering movement. Of course, it's not perfect, and it works better in some states where there's more literacy than in other states. But it's a very interesting development. The other thing, as my final remark, is that India is stuffed full of coalition governments. which means that the centre can no longer act unilaterally. It has to listen to the regional governments, and the regional governments represent their states very strongly. So in a sense, there's a greater accent towards regionalisation. Thank you.
Paul, thank you very much. I think that both speakers came to the conclusion that federalism means division of powers between upper and lower level of governance, and that currently there are two major processes going on hand by hand. And this is on one hand decentralization, so it means deriving powers to lower level of governance, either the states or provinces or local level, as Paul was saying, and on the other hand, the power is shifted towards upper level. It means, in the case of Europe, it's European level and also international level. And we do have also more actors in the game. We are speaking about that constantly, that besides state, this is also market and this is civil society. So when looking at current situation in the world, we are speaking about multi-level governance with more actors in the game. So the picture is broader, more complex and more complicated. I have got a quotation here from the book by Professor Thomas Huglin. Thomas Huglin is professor from Canadian Wilfrid Laurier University, and he is considered to be one of the most known experts on federalism. And he wrote that the European Union is a federal system, even though obviously not a conventional federal state. So I think that we can have a lot of opinions, but I think that you are eager to ask questions and to use the fact that we have got here two distinguished people. So I would like to ask you to introduce yourself. It was Radim Palouš who was the first. So
I think it was very important not to start with federalism, but federalization. I mean, a certain process and not state. Because there are at least two distinct examples. One is process started with confederation, going to federation, US example, and something else is Czechoslovak example, going from unitarian state to the federation. It might be the case of Ukraine in the future. They have unitarian state that they want to federalize. I think that Peter Pithard knows a lot the toils of the debates that took place before our famous Velvet divorce. How to settle the issue between Czechs and Slovaks, whether we should start, I would say, from unitarian moment and to decentralize, or to stay for a couple of minutes, separate and just to remarry again. So this is the moment. The second thing is, I know that in law schools, here at least, there's a big debate, where does European law belong to? Is it international law or is it constitutional law? It's specific area, it's somewhere in between. I know that in the area of European human rights, there is a very interesting movement here. On the one hand, the question is, what are these constitutional treaties? Are they just expression of will of parties, or they have something more in them? That's why they are using so-called evolutive interpretation that allows two judges not only to look at the intention in the original moment, but to look at the changed circumstances of the day and to to be, I would say, judicially made sometimes too active or proactive. And then in this area, that's the end, there is another doctrine used just to a little bit balance this evolutive interpretation. It's called margins of appreciation. It means that local judges are always expected they know better than European judges. what are the limits of, let's say, freedom of expression, for instance. So, European judges are only expected to do so-called supervision, and they are not going to run into the business of local judges. So what we see here is an interesting tendency for centralization through evolutive interpretation and decentralization at the same time, respecting the local specificities.
We may collect 3 questions. Senator Outrata.
Yes, thank you. Can I be here? I want to take issue with the caption over there. The difference between the American and the European is supposed to be, according to the caption, whether it is top-down or bottom-up. I don't see that way at all. I think, particularly, the American example is completely top-down. I think the major difference between the two is, well, first of all, historical. I mean, the American one is there for 200 years, so we are comparing a completely different state of federalization between the two. But if we correct against that, we take the US in, let's say, 1840 or whatever, which would be about the time, I see the biggest difference in the starting point. All other federations but the European have started with the essential functions of state. The idea was to put together a system of central institutions, which then worked itself down to a point that was considered optimal between in the distribution of powers between the federation and the component parts. In Europe, for historical reasons, it started from merging the economies, which at that point were very isolated, and built itself up from there into institutions. And I think we're suffering the results of that. I was first afraid that this statement that Europe is not prepared for federalism should be more absolute. Now, the way Professor Flather put it, I would agree. I mean, we are in the process of developing the federation here from a starting point which is very different from the American one, and for that matter, the Indian also, and any other, with the possible exception of Switzerland, where I'm not so sure. Here we have the problem. We have to introduce somehow the basic functions of state in order to make the federation, really. Now, my question would be, do you agree with that? Or is there something wrong in what I'm saying? Thank you.
The third question, please. Some person behind, I can't see you, sorry, because of the light.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Shabu Sondana. I try to make some few contributions to the issues of this federalism. One thing I find so interesting has told me is the problems of the meaning of what is actually federalism and what is not. In view of my research into what is federalism and what is not federalism, there are two things. How is federalism actually being cultivated is one thing we should understand. America does not establish federalism or just like fix the idea of federalism. Federalism is an idea that needs to be negotiated, agreed upon, through the issues of what to do with constitutionalism. But then, when you look back to the history of European Union, which started around 1951, building on the issues of stability, breaking the issues of anarchy, and bringing into the issue of common interest and development of what the world has broken. Today, we have seen actually a kind of a modification of European Union. Of course, you want to build federalism, but then you have to develop it from the area of constitutionalism. Which of the European Union states today wants to give part of its power to form a federation? This is one of the fundamental and one of the questions. You want to form a federalism? Have you agreed on the constitutionalism of giving all the power of your right, of your state, to the central government? Or how is it going to be decentralized? Until this is actually put in order, I find no comparison between federalism in the United States, or talk of in Switzerland, or we talk about the federalism probably in Australia. When the British left in around 1901, they came together, the six colonies, established what is called federalism today. So, if EU want to form a federalism, you need to be cultivated, you need to be designed through a system of constitutionalism. Of course, I see it not happen, so I don't see EU as a federal state. Rather, it has something different. Thank you.
So thank you. So I will ask Jan first and then Paul. Is that all right?
Yes, but my response will be very short. I absolutely agree with Mr. Otrata. I find it very inspiring what he said. Like, it's just maybe if I'm thinking about it, like, isn't it like what is considered essential role of the state, like, or some central institution, isn't it like accepted a little bit differently these days? Perhaps the elites and the economic elites decided the essential role is these days central banking, whereas when the federation was created, it was foreign policy, elementary defense, etc. Otherwise, somehow we decided that the essential role of federation is ECB because it is created as a purely federal institution. So that's probably all. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think the first contribution from Professor Palush is a very important reminder. I think the role of law in creating a, if you like, a federal atmosphere. I don't like the word federal because it really does mean so many different things. And for my country, we're on the periphery of what it means, if you like. I mean, we really are sometimes an island, and we have such a different meaning. So but perhaps non-lawyers don't study enough the power and importance of the processes that you described. I have learnt a lot from my legal friends about these processes, and I think that the evolutive interpretation and the marginal appreciations are incredibly important principles, and political scientists need to be more up to speed when they bandy about their language, which we tend to do. So I think that's absolutely critical, and actually it shows, you know, how well we try to do things. Because my answer to the second question, Senator, I do agree with you. Of course, we're starting from a different point of view. I mean, that's the whole point. And what I do believe is that we're on a great experiment. We're on a great. This is one of the great political experiments of all time, perhaps, to actually see if we can somehow create a acceptable common space, which is liberal, democratic, which values both wealth creation, to use yesterday's language, and equality, to somehow create a good combination of the principles that we all share. And this is a great experiment, and it's going to be hugely difficult, because we're not starting with the unitary state. Absolutely correct. And the key people, I'm thinking more and more, are the individual national parliaments and prime ministers. When you become prime minister, such a sweat to be prime minister, isn't it? The last thing you want to do is hand the prize over. Look at Mr. Klaus. When he became president, he didn't want to leave all the power of being prime minister behind. So you can imagine it multiplied 28 times. So absolutely agree with you. It's a problem But I suspect, and this is my final remark and a little bit to our friend from Nigeria, I suspect that the trend now is the other way. In other words, the answer to our problems seems to be more Europe. But the people, we, the people, this is the dialogue project, we're trying to listen to the people. Are we going to accept that? Because I suspect that in the European elections, there's going to be a lot of shocks. Last night I was reading an article about UKIP. You know, it's this anti-European party in Britain. It's going to win the European elections in Britain. I mean, that's not to say a lot, because as people pointed out, the turnout will be 35%. It'll be up because of the frenetic work of UKIP. And they will have a number of seats in Brussels, but they probably won't get many seats, if any, in the Westminster Parliament. So there'll be a lot of protest against whatever version of Europe they want to put up. And they'll invent a bogeyman version, and they'll try to get votes against that. And the protests, we know, aren't just about Europe, and they're not just about migration. There's a general alienation to do with the crisis, to do with poverty, to do with austerity policy, but it'll be reflected in that. So there is a conundrum.
Thank you. I would like to add one comment. When there was and still is the debate about the future of Europe, then those who are really for deepening of integration, they do not like the word federalism. Why? Because for them federalism is a taxative list of the division of powers, which is based in the constitution. What is decided on European level or federal level, and what is decided on the national level or the level of parts of the federation. Because they think that once you have a taxative list, then this is not a process. It's then difficult to change it. And they are considering Europeanization or integration to be a process towards deepening. But I do understand that mostly federalism is perceived in Europe as centralization, and that's why there is certain allergy against the term. There are Romanio, I do believe, and then two others, Mr. Jandowski.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. As you have mentioned, and as Jan Macháček mentioned, federalism means division of powers, and your last remarks were precise. And I would like to apply that principle of division of powers to the issue of taxation. Division of powers means that certain issues of public policy are federal responsibility, and those decisions are binding for all member states and their citizens. In that sense, they are one political society, one vision. On the other hand, other issues reserved to member states are their own only, and their public policies could be completely independent. And let us, this federalist principle, apply to the issue of taxation. Yesterday we heard suggestions that perhaps the way to go forward is to go forward towards harmonization of taxation. It seems to me to be completely incompatible with federalism. Why to have the same taxes in Sweden, for example, and Estonia? It seems to me to run counter the idea of federalism. But on the other hand, and that's my second and last remark, the federalist principle applied to taxation would mean that the central federal European Parliament has a direct right to directly tax European citizens and then use revenue from those taxes for paying for, providing for exercise of their legitimate powers. So it seems to me that legitimate would be to have a direct European tax in order that it doesn't reach to sky-high heights. It should be kept, for example, 5% at maximum income tax. Every European will pay at most 5% of his or her income, and then immediately, it seems to me, there will rise European politics, pan-European parties, and elections to the European Parliament will become interesting to European citizens. For example, one political party will suggest, let us have 1% income tax, Other political pan-European party will suggest 3%, and the most European optimistic one will suggest 5%. And we European citizens will have a real choice, and European politics will be born. And my question is, would you agree with me or not?
Interesting question, but we will collect another two. There is a person in the same row, yes. And then Mr. Jantovský.
Thank you very much. I was surprised how little we talked about law at this conference. Nicely surprised as a lawyer. But it was mentioned, Martin mentioned it, we had advantage here, that you can't have federalism without the rule of law. One law, I mean. And I can, we love cases, and I can give you a scenario of the next crisis, which is looming. German Constitutional Court has submitted a preliminary question to Luxembourg. The question is exactly about whether the European Stability Pact is consistent with the body of European law. If you read the question is formulated so that the German court almost indicates it believes it is ultra vires. It is in contradiction with the European law. Even if the Luxembourg court rules it's not ultra vires, that it's perfectly consistent with the body of European law, then the German Constitutional Court reserves the right to say it contradicts the German Constitution, and therefore German Bundesbank is ruled out of the European Stability Pact. And this is exactly why federalism formula or federalism models don't apply to Europe, because you don't have a rule of one law, and actually the rule of law may very easily, and is quite likely, easily to destroy the whole European Stability Pact and therefore bring the European Union into the crisis on unprecedented scale. So this is one remark. The other remark is about the class, because it's a very important argument about social, not national, not ethnic, but social homogeneity in Europe. And I think Larry's concept of class is a very British one. It's aspirational. In Britain, believe it or not, people believe that middle class means 90,000 pounds annual income and kids going to public schools, when the average family income is 30,000 and public schools are attended by 8% of population. In this respect, the European continent may be more Americanized than Britain, because we believe that it's actually people on average income.
Thank you, Jiří, and His Excellency, Mr. Jantovský.
Thank you. I have two remarks, and I want to thank Professor Rovná for clearly defining one of the functions of federalism as a division of powers and competencies to the various levels of organization, and in the European parlance we have several principles for that, creating a stronger union on the one hand, subsidiarity on the other hand, etc., etc. And so the debate then is about the most effective and rational division of the powers between the levels. But that's only one function of federalism in the American sense. In the Federalist Papers, and I apologize for correcting Paul, but Publius was not just Hamilton and Madison, but also John Jay to make the triad. There is a clear discussion of the explicit motive for the federal system, which is prevention of tyranny. And tyranny, meaning of course the British monarch, against whom the settlers rebelled, and who was the in the writing of the Federalist, who was the straw man against whom all the new principles and values of federalism were designed. And I think it's important to keep this in mind, because it was a way of taking power away from the central level and distributing it to the lower levels. In Europe, what we are undertaking is something a little different. And my second remark goes to Jan. Jan, maybe there is a way to artificially create a nation. I suppose so. But the precedents we had in Europe in the 20th century, namely the Soviet nation, the Yugoslav nation, and unfortunately also the Czechoslovak nation did not fare too well. I mean, we should also remember that.
Thank you. Maybe there was one lady who, yes please, and then we will ask the speakers. So then there will be next round, the last one.
Thank you. What I really wanted to do was to say thank you to everyone who's spoken today and yesterday, because I found it to be quite interesting. And I have a recommendation for you all if you're trying to avoid the problems that we have created in the United States. That there is an article published in the New York Review of Books in December of 2013 entitled Our Broken Constitution, which basically reflects the fact that we have demolished in many respects, or certainly sidestepped, democracy from the very beginning. And maybe that would be helpful to you as you're trying to build.
Thank you very much. So I will start with Paul this time, and then, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. I believe in a European tax, but I'm sure many people don't. I love paying my tax. Sometimes my friends say, oh, I've got to do my tax, I'm not feeling well, and all this sort of thing. It's the only way that I feel a citizen. Now, you see, I came on a boat from India to Britain, and I've had a wonderful time there. As I said before, I mean, I have 3 countries, India, Britain, and Czech Republic. And paying tax makes me feel complete, it makes me feel a citizen, besides which I am of that persuasion that wants to look after people, that builds hospitals and so on. So I'm totally in favour of that, and I do agree with your analysis, actually. I think it will change the politics at a stroke. I nearly commented on the German constitutional issue when I was agreeing with Professor Palush. I decided to sidestep it. Jiří, you've reminded us, I do agree that it can be a huge crisis, but I suspect it won't be for this reason, that most of the German political elite don't want it to be a crisis. The strict interpretation of the Constitutional Court forces them, and you know what Germans are like, if there's a rule, they'll follow it, probably twice over. The strict interpretation forces them to do exactly what they're doing, but they keep telegraphing ahead, they keep telling the opposition to get prepared, they give tips on how to rebut it. I think that there are brothers or friends involved in the court and in the parliament and in Mrs. Merkel's cabinet who discuss these things every night over a glass or 2 of whiskey or whatever they drink. So I think they will prevent it, but you're absolutely right. It could be a terrible crisis if they couldn't do it. Your point about class, perhaps you're right. I mean, you live in Cardiff, you know as much as anybody. It's a very wobbly term, but I don't think that the middle class in England has. I mean, the average household income is actually £21,000. So £90,000, I think you're very much in the upper middle class or lower upper class, as I like to call it. And public school, yes, you're right, 7 or 8%. But I think I take your point. Michael, thank you. Yes, I think my point in going back to those original debates was precisely to show the difference the systems in America and Europe are different. And I'm trying to, because we're discussing this, we're looking for difference and similarity. We're trying to learn. We're trying to understand more. And I think that one of the ways of understanding the difference is to go back to those early debates in the 1780s, which are, you don't have to be a scholar to enjoy them. You can go and dig them up, and they're beautifully written pieces, and there's wonderful discussion, wonderful, colourful language. It's very different from our debates. That's the point. We made this point in the first round. I think the Senator brought it to our attention in a focused way, but I hope we've been saying it anyway from the platform. We are starting at different places, and we're going on different journeys, and we are different cultures and different peoples, and there's different history. But I thought that, so I agree, it started differently, but that was the point. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, first point is that I am surprised, but I fully agree with what Roman Joch said. I would like to see political parties in Europe proposing the percentage of common European budget. With what Mr. Přibaň said, it's actually it just confirms what I was trying to explain. Like, ECB is a federal institution. Now, German Constitutional Court decided or ruled that so-called open outright monetary transactions, which is this, I will do whatever it's necessary to save the Eurozone, but it were never applied in practice, actually. It's just like in a way a nuclear deterrent, so it's a questionable if a German Constitutional Court can rule on it. But it ruled on it, and it refused these outright monetary transactions, which means buying, for those who don't understand, possibility in an emergency situation, in a state of attack on the Eurozone, to directly buy bonds issued by national government, for instance. And but Germans found out that in a federal system within the ECB, they can be overruled. They were overruled, and even if they were voting no, they were overruled. And the rest of the process has been described by Mr. Přibaň. So I just only can apologize that when I was mentioning other institutions and symbols of federalism like upper chamber and federal bond, etc., I didn't mention that we should really have a judicial system in place which is more compatible in what we can see as a federation. But this is, so that's why I said, like, if you create a first very important or most important institution on a federal principle, you have to create other institutions on the federal principle. And we are coming to a major clash here, and we don't know what's going to be the result. With Michael Žantovský, when he mentioned the tyranny, the British king, and etc., so there are different. It just came to my mind that what could be the modern tyranny? Perhaps the people would find out that this over-centralized system, that non-existence of the common federal budget or common central budget is replaced by a system of two levels of preliminary fiscal controls, another fiscal control after the budget is approved, by rigidities, limits, bureaucratic controls. So this is, and we were discussing yesterday, like, where all this leads, and it's not accompanied by any new political legitimacy being created. It is not accompanied by some level of acceptable solidarity, and it's just very surprising to me why it is so clear to Germans that they would never base their common German state on a system of fees and controls and rigidities, but they understand very well that they have to have some common German budget. Why they find it so hard to imagine on an European level. So perhaps sooner or later people in Italy and Spain, or young people in Italy and Spain, would protest against this system of rigidities and controls and dictates from the center, which is not accompanied by political legitimacy. And with the second point, what Michael Žantovský said, like artificial creating of nations. So I would humbly say that I wasn't the one who was speaking about artificial creation of a political nation. I was speaking about artificial supporting or strengthening of the second identity of a normal European. So because I said that I am not so naive that anytime soon we would call ourselves, as said, Euro Czechs or something. Actually, we are sitting on something which used to be called Euro chair. But I humbly said that I support artificial strengthening of the second political or the second identity, which is being a European. And as I said before, what is artificial and what is spontaneous, like this is for a special conference for philosophers.
Thank you very much. I was given the signal by the organizers that this was the last round. So I think that we didn't exactly find an answer for the question whether European Union is a federation, but I would like to propose another term, and this is differentiated federalization. So it means that in some fields we can see that there is a process of federalization going on. In some fields we can be hesitant, as Paul said. Otherwise, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers. I would like to ask those who were posing questions. I would like to thank very much all persons who were here with us, and thank you to organizers. Thank you.
This is not the end. We want to wrap up our 2 days of discussion. I would like to ask Jacques Rovný at the box and in a short way, which is his way, let's have a look at the 2 days of discussion before we end our conference.
Well, thank you, Father. I know that I am the only thing standing between this conference and lunch, and I will really make sure this is brief. I will not attempt to summarize. Let me bring you, however, one bit of good news, and that is apparently that Mr. Yanukovych has disappeared from the presidential palace. No one quite sure where he is. Some people say he might have gone to Donetsk. Others say that his plane might have landed in Saudi Arabia. The last dictator who went to Saudi Arabia was Mr. Ben Ali, as far as I remember, so he would be in good company. Anyway, so this is how we started with the Ukrainian question and Václav Havel's thoughts on that, and I think Ukraine has been very much on our minds as we were talking about the crisis of Europe, because this is a big paradox we are discussing, and yesterday's speeches were often very pessimistic. If you look at Petr Pidhar's speech or Klaus Offer, all of them listed everything that is wrong with Europe, and at the end they managed to bring some positive conclusions that all is not lost. It all depends where you're looking from. If you're looking from Belgrade, if you're looking from Kiev, Europe has kept a formidable capacity of attraction. Adenauer used to call it Magnet Europa. That magnet is still there at the periphery. And the contrast between the attraction on the periphery and the depression inside is really striking, and I felt even in our discussion yesterday more than today was the case. Another difference between yesterday and today, I think yesterday was interesting because we questioned some of the basic mantras on which the European integration had developed for more than half a century. And that was very interesting. And of course, if you're doing that, questioning the well-trodden paths and the assumptions, well, then of course you are in a sort of critical mode, and very rightly so. Today we were kind of looking more forward. You know, what about European civil society? What about the question of federalism? Is that the way forward? So I think the two. The mood in both yesterday and today was quite different, and the take on our European crisis was a bit different. The two mantras we have questioned yesterday was the assumption we've had from the beginning of European construction that common market and democracy are, you know, inextricably linked. They go together, and that was a sort of a self-evident truth, as they say, as the founding fathers would put it, and this is a self-evident truth. Well, perhaps it is not, and yesterday we've heard this is not. And the second assumption was that the common market, the market fosters European integration. Well, we've heard from Ivan Krastev, among others, that this is not necessarily the case. So, on the first assumption, what really we have discovered that yes, the European common market was synonymous with democracy in a divided Europe. That was a self-evident proposition indeed, because there was the other Europe, the non-democratic Europe. And all the countries that were building the European project were democracies, and in a way extending the democratic sphere. So that assumption was never questioned. The crisis forces us to do so, and yesterday several speakers have described it in detail, how in a situation of global markets, if you have global markets, well, your connection with democracy is changed. Suddenly governments have to be responsible to global financial markets more than to their voters. If they do so, they go in a technocratic posture. This is what we have to do. Klaus Hofer again, he said, TINA, no alternative, this is what has to be done. So you are in a technocratic posture, you're responding to the crisis, but of course you're hollowing out the democratic process. So this is the Mario Monti syndrome, and Mario Monti in the best, you know, one of the best European technocrats that you can get. The only problem was the democratic legitimacy, all right? The second response to that is not technocracy, but a populist. They say, well, you know, if you tell us there is no alternative, we'll make sure there is one. And we have simple answers to complicated issues. Pick your country, we have them in all of our countries. And this is not a problem of post-communist Eastern Europe. This is a problem of the European Union, and particularly the Southern Europe, where it is most badly affected by the crisis, but not only. And this is a debate, you know, between politics and policy. The European project associated with policy without politics, and the populist challenging it, saying, you know, we want politics back, and we don't care about your policy. And of course, that then creates a very precarious situation for democratic debate, and all the more important, therefore, to think about ways the European democratic dimension can be reformulated and reinvented. And I think this is what we've heard this morning. Similarly, the assumption that markets and foster European integration, we used to call it the common market. EHS, Evropský společný trh, common market. Well, now we see that common market can tear the integration process apart. This is what we have seen over the last 5 years. This is no longer the East-West divide. If you sum up the last years, convergence between East and West, growing convergence, but growing divergence North-South. So we have that, almost a breaking point by the market as a force of disintegration. So these two mantras that we had for half a century, mutually reinforcing democracy and integration, that no longer holds, and that means we are in a critical mode, and you've heard different ways to cope with it. This morning, we've heard the more positive, more upbeat approach to the problems, to the crisis, and we have heard the first statement by our friend Přiban was that he was skeptical about Europe based on values, this whole idea of European values, because there are different values, and we have a clash of values, and in fact, if you push your politics of values too hard, well, you go for conflict, and you can create nightmares. So that may well be the case. But he said that therefore he thought the founding fathers was a bit disingenuous. They were, he said, Jean Monnet saying, if I had to start, I would start with sculpture. First of all, I looked for this quote, and I never found it. If somebody has found the quote, let me know. I read his memoirs several times, and I never found that quote. Though it's a nice quote. I mean, we all like to start culture. Who's against culture, right? No, but what you do find in Jean Monnet's memoirs is the connection between interest and values. And that was there from the beginning. It's a combination. It's not, either or. He describes a scene when he goes to see Adenauer with a project of what became the Schuman Plan, the founding moment of the Korenstein community. And he says that Adenauer reads it, and he looks at it and says, this is extremely important what you are proposing. What you are proposing is something of a higher moral order. Higher moral order. It's about coal and steel. Higher moral order. Perfectly understood immediately at first reading the connection between the two. And I think this is what we have lost over time. This was the genius of the founding fathers, that they could combine the values. Yeah, he understood this was about peace project, this was about certain values. And that you couldn't simply raise the federalist flag to connect with our recent discussion, but you had to go at it a different way. But that connection was there from the beginning, and therefore, I think if the European project has a chance, is certainly not just to say politics of values versus interests. No, we have to constantly try to combine the initial drive that was there. Then the second issue that you had discussed this morning that was very interesting. The repoliticization, okay, Europe as a factor of depoliticization, we have heard that, and that is of course true, and that was in a way inherent to the way the European Union was conceived as a machine to produce consensus. This was not a machine about majority voting. They didn't have any votes. It was permanent stýkání, potýkání, negotiating, permanent negotiating until they produce something. And usually what you produce then is not terribly interesting for the wide public because it's a compromise, it's a consensus, but that allows you to move on. So it's not something very glorious and very exciting. And it's certainly, you are right about the fact that this is no longer possible. Not just because of what I said about market and democracy and market and integration, okay? This no longer, and simply because in the meantime we have the revolution of numbers. what you had, making consensus with the founding 6, or even if you go to 12, that's one thing. We are 28. With hopefully enlargement to the Balkans, we will be 35. God knows, if one day Ukraine and others, we will be 40. You cannot have simply a machine at working with consensus. So you have to introduce a politicization, a democratic politicization, and then you are there confronted with the issues that you have discussed, which is both the civil society, that you cannot have that politicization simply from above, okay, the elite model that has failed, you have to include civil society, and that secondly, that will connect with the question of federalism, where again I see and I share the well, two things maybe should be said. Why is it now an urgent question? Simply because the euro crisis forces you to decide about what to do with common currency. If you have a common currency that is a common kitty, which is supposed to provide guarantees to the members, well, then you have common rules about how you manage it, and therefore you come very close to issues that have been mentioned, you know, budgets, taxation, etc. Well, as soon as you say taxation, you have to bring in the democratic process. You cannot leave it to the best Mario Montis of this world. You have to, you have or Mr. Draghi or other central bankers. There you have to have the democratic process, and therefore there you connect with the federal dimension. If number of states, 18, if they share a common currency, they'll have to address that question. Call it federalism, if you find a better word. I think the idea, Martin Paluch suggesting that it is a process, I rather like that idea, because I don't believe in the perfect federal constitution that will fall from the sky one morning or after a long session in Brussels. No, it will be a federal process, and it will be an entirely new kind of, if it happens, it will be an entirely new kind of federalism, very different from the American model. But we certainly cannot rely on what the founding fathers did. They were federalists, but didn't want to say so, and that's why they did coal and steel and common market. They went the other way. Then you had what I call the inadvertent federalists. You know, Merkel, Sarkozy fixing the European crisis, each time moving us closer to a common shared responsibility for the currency, but without explicitly making the political statement. And now we are in the explicit phase, you know. That's why yesterday I was mentioning Havel and Havel's federalist speeches, because suddenly people can reread them and see that they were actually very far-sighted. There are two obstacles, and they were mentioned this morning. Two obstacles to this. Honza Macháček mentioned the fact that, you know, federalism means different things to different people. You know, it's an obvious connection to democracy for Americans and Germans, for instance. It doesn't fit in French political culture. For instance, France never had a federal, and is seen very differently in former Yugoslavia, former Czechoslovakia, former Soviet Union, because it is seen as a legacy of communism, or it is seen as a failure, something that has failed. So we are reinventing something which is not a federalism by dissociation, but a federalism by association. And that's why Martin Paluch said it is a federalization as a process. You know, that federalism by association, and we will see how far it will get us. The main second obstacle is the democratic backing for it, because again, this is something that you cannot promote without democratic legitimacy. And it is enough to look at opinion polls about Europe, throughout Europe, about trust in Europe, trust in European institutions, trust in euro as a currency. But it also fits about trust in domestic political parties, in domestic institutions, you know. When we say it's bad news for Europe, there's low trust, look at the trust in political parties in our various countries. You know, why should European democracy be so much better than our domestic democracy? There's no reasons for that, to have kind of double standards. But basically, this is where I see the second main obstacle. The first one, we mean different things. Federalism means different things to different people. That's an incentive to have debate. This is what we try. This is why we need the European dialogue. You know, you want to discuss federalism, and if it's going to be a process, well, you have to start somewhere, and the blueprint will not happen just like that. And before we have another convent, no, we have to start. You know, what do we understand? That we can do. The second part, more difficult, is to reconnect the trust of citizens, and that's where the civil society dimension is crucially, transnational civil society becomes crucially important. If you have something like that, there you have the answer to the national populist fall back onto the domestic playground. The final point, back to Ukraine, is that yes, crisis forces us to rethink democracy. It forces us to think about the issues such as federalism and European civil society. It also forces us, the Ukrainian crisis, forces us to rethink the question of Europe as an international actor. Because the whole point about the EU, that it has been conceived and it has been built in order to contain power, not to project power. As a response to different attempts to impose a European order. So there you have basically geopolitics is banned, is not part of the DNA of the European project. And suddenly the Ukrainian crisis forces us to think in geopolitical terms. Not because we like it, but because some other actors think in those terms. It's not just because Europeans want global governance and global civil society and global human rights, etc. That you are in a world where other international players believe in power politics. The Chinese, the Americans, the Russians, etc. The famous BRICS, etc. They think in terms of logic of power. So the question, when we are confronted with a crisis like the Ukraine, suddenly forces us to rethink that fundamental assumption about geopolitics is not part of the horizon of European thinking. Final word. Yesterday we've heard two things. One, Ivan Krastev, one opposite from Klaus Offer. Klaus Offer said there is no exit from the euro. No possibility, and therefore we have to do this and that and the other if we want to. Ivan Krastev suggested the opposite. He said, never trust people who say never. Never trust people who say this cannot happen. Those who said so only at their own expense. And therefore he said, you know, and I've been to a couple of conferences he organized when comparisons were made with the disintegration of the European Union and of the Soviet Union, of Yugoslavia, etc., etc. These comparisons are very dubious. But I mean, both propositions offer there is no exit. Oh my God, are we trapped in the euro? This is, I don't believe in it. Or Ivan's thing, things can unravel, things can disintegrate. Both propositions are certainly an invitation to confront the unthinkable, to confront something that we have taken for granted, not taking Europe for granted. I think that is a kind of concluding common assumption in this conference. And in the dialogue we want to continue. Pavel Seifter had this wonderful initiative, the Václav Havel Library, Marta Smolíková picked it up, and yeah, with other partners, with docs where we are here, we have, I think, tried to get a start to this discussion, because the idea, of course, is to continue, and to continue not necessarily in Prague. We have plans to continue in Bruges, in Berlin, but I think also hopefully in Sarajevo, perhaps in Kiev. So that's basically where we are in our discussion, and why there are good reasons to continue. And I will leave the last word to Marta Smolíková, without whom this could not have been possible.
The last word, I would like to thank our TV viewers, because the whole conference was broadcasted through Czech television. So those who remain with us should be thanked. I would like to thank all of you, all the speakers, and the whole conference can be downloaded and will be available on the internet site of the library of Václav Havel. So the speech of Petr Pithart and other documents will be available, and about all other activities we will be planning and hopefully also implementing. I would like to thank our interpreters, and I think some of you enjoyed the interpretation, so thanks.
A těm z vás, kdo ještě neviděli
And those of you who have not seen the exhibition in Docs, you have the opportunity to see it free of charge. I can recommend the exhibition, and those who are interested in the books published by the library, including the European speeches and texts by Václav Havel, you can buy these books at the entrance. Thanks a lot, and see you soon.